Well, thank you for coming. I'm Emily Dalton-Smith. I'm a program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where I support learning technologies for K-12. I'm really excited to have today a panel of fantastic people who are working on games for learning, taking different approaches to it. They all have a lot of expertise in this space and a lot more to say. I'm really excited to hear from them today. So to my right is Eric Klopfer. Eric is a professor of science education and engineering systems and director of the Scheller Teacher Education Program in the Education Arcade at MIT. Next to Eric is Jessica Lindell, the general manager of the Glass Lab, which is a research and development lab for learning games funded by the MacArthur Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and supported by ESA. To Jessica's right is Jesse Pickard, co-founder and chief executive officer of Mind Snacks, an education gaming company. And then we have Zoran Popovic, who is the director of the Center for Game Science and a professor at the University of Washington, and the founder and CTO of Engage Learning. So thank you guys very much for being here today. If you guys to start, so I'm going to deviate a little bit from our instructions here, and I'd love for you guys just to tell us one sentence about what you're working on and what you guys think the power and potential of games for learning represents.
Starting with me?
Go for it.
So the big project we're working on right now is a massively multiplayer online game for learning math and biology for high school students. And I think the power of games is really about a couple things. One is sort of structuring learning in unique and personal yet shared ways, and I can come back to that later. And the other is sort of developing a sense of identity through those games.
So the product we're working on right now is actually taking the new SimCity game that came out about a month ago, and we're embedding it with formative assessments for middle school kids. I think this is a great exemplar of the power of games and learning, in that it's just reaching a much higher level of engagement for middle school students than what they're used to in anything that they're working with in the classroom. And it's giving educators trusted data on their learning in an ongoing formative assessment way.
Hi, to date we've worked on foreign language learning games and as well as test prep games, and we're moving out into geography and history and math, and so that's going to be a really exciting journey for us. I think our primary mission is to get people excited about learning. I know that's a really simple statement, but that's really what we're here to do.
My primary sort of goal when I think about what I'm really trying to do is to try to create world-class experts through a completely different pathway of learning. And the games are actually one of the principal ways in which I can both optimize for mastery and engagement at the same time. Some of you may have heard of Foldit game that produced experts from novices that were able to produce 3 Nature papers in just a year and a half. More recently, we're trying to apply similar techniques onto specific math content, and more broadly to actually apply the entire game structures, deep engagement game structures onto the entire coursework.
So those are some pretty big aspirations for games. Can you guys talk a little bit about when games are the right tools and when they might not be? I think a lot of people have talked about games as kind of a panacea, as a silver bullet for learning. And where do you guys see them fitting in particularly well? Start, Zoran?
Yeah, I mean, games, obviously, I mean, there's a lot of expectations from the games, just as with any other new mechanism that you can reach out to people. But I think the promise lies in basically looking at learning what I call in vivo, meaning in live. Basically, somebody just comes to a particular experience and learns from it, rather than being forced to it by sitting on a chair for a certain amount of hours every day. And so if you start looking at learning in that particular context, you see that everything is completely different than the standard way. And I think that's where the promise is, because you can start having people that self-identify with the entity that's cool, as opposed to consider it something that they have to do.
I guess you'd probably disagree, but I think games have a more difficult time, at least for the time being, teaching very advanced concepts. And as a product designer, we try to focus on more basic concepts that absolutely need to be learned in the beginning, and that's where we really see our games take off and get true engagement.
So I'll disagree with that. So the focus that we have with SimCity is around problem solving, which when you speak to any educator in a middle school setting and they have to teach problem solving, it's incredibly challenging, and that's a huge focus of the new Common Core assessments. So the game that we're working on is, I think, very elegant in being able to educate students on how to tackle problem solving and more complex higher order thinking skills. I'll also just expand Emily's question a little bit further, and not just what are games good for, but what type of learners are they especially excellent for. So we do a lot of work in the middle schools that we're targeting and do a lot of co-development with those users. And we found that the typical types of students that you would expect are really excited about games, so gifted and talented students. Everyone was skipping recess to come in and play with our prototypes. But we also found that English language learners were having an exceptional benefit from games. And that's just because of the context upon which they're learning in this game-like atmosphere where they have a much more motivating, challenging environment to be in. And they understand much more deeply the types of challenges that they would be having, the academic vocabulary that they need to be able to use to be able to excel at that game.
I like Zoran's answer of learning in vivo, but I'll sort of add a little bit of another dimension to that, which is I think games are really useful when the learning goals and the game mechanics align well. And a lot of people sort of think about educational games as we're going to layer some fun on top of some sort of learning. And certainly you can do it that way, and it may be better than just having the learning without any fun. But it's really not when games are at their best. It's really about thinking about how can you use game mechanics to show what's really fun about learning particular topics. So if you're thinking about math, it's not about sort of just rote memorization of math problems and figuring out how you gamify that, but thinking about if you look at someone doing math, where's the fun in that? It's using math to solve problems. It's finding patterns. So how can we pick up on those things and use those things as part of the game mechanics? So it's sort of a general answer, but I think it's at its best when you can really find great alignment between those. And that involves iteration in the design process, where you need to think about, here's the general sorts of things I want to learn, here's the general kinds of games I think that might be useful for that, and then iterating back and forth into those, and seeing if you find an alignment, and if you do, that's great, you can work on a project in that space, and if you can't, then you either go back to the drawing board or you move on.
So Eric, what does that look like? Because you're building a math MMO, which means you have to make it really interesting and engage lots of people constantly for the game to really work. So what does it look like to design the game mechanics to meet the learning objectives and have kids have fun at the same time? Sure.
So for those of you that don't know the general idea of massive multiplayer online games, typically, not always, but typically in role-playing games, online role-playing games, the idea is you have some sort of quest, and a character in the game gives you a quest, and then you have some sort of thing that you need to do. In many MMOs, it's like, go kill 10 of these things for me, or go collect 8 of these objects and then bring it back to me, and then I'm going to give you the next quest in this line. In our game, each of those quest lines, as they're called, is about a particular topic area. And one of the important things we did in the original design was we thought about, okay, for biology curriculum, these are the dozen topics that we might be able to cover in a biology curriculum. Which of those do we think sort of work well in that context? So if we're putting this in a real world, it's a simulated world, sort of a real simulated world. And what kinds of quests work well in that? And we did iterate on some of those, and in some cases we found like there wasn't a very good alignment. And sometimes we thought it was a great alignment, we put it in front of kids very early on, which is important. And they said that wasn't a great idea. Other things we thought maybe, well, this really might not work very well for kids, but when we put it in front of them, they were really excited about it. And so it was that iterative process of us thinking about what fits well with the game mechanics that we had aligned here, getting feedback from kids, and then also getting feedback from teachers as well in terms of where do they really have needs in this space. Sometimes we have ideas for great games, and we say, we're going to cover this topic, and it's going to take 6 weeks of gameplay to do this, and they say, that's great, but we spend 30 minutes on that topic, so that's not really going to work very well for us. So it's important to have that as part of the process as well.
So how do you guys engage students and teachers and other users in early feedback? I know some of it is the work that Eric does describe, putting it really in front of people and doing focus groups, but I know some of you collect a lot of user data to identify what's interesting, what's relevant, and most importantly, how much students are learning through these. So tell us what that means and how you actually get data out of these games that tells you whether a kid is using something or not and whether they're learning.
Sure, I can take that one. So, well, prior to release, we'll engage in a lot of play testing, and what that means is that we'll go into schools, or we'll bring kids in, or adults, and we will just watch how they're playing and pick up on a lot of little design flaws during that process. But once we actually release the app, then we are, day by day, we're looking at our retention data, and we're actually releasing multiple versions of the games, and we're seeing which ones are picked up on more than others. And we pay a lot of attention to that, and then we'll whatever the test winner is, we'll actually just land on that, and that will be the one that actually stands the test of time and actually exists in our app from that point forward.
So Jessica, how do you guys know you're building formative assessments into SimCity? How do you actually know if kids are developing critical thinking skills or not through this?
Yeah, so I think we're fortunate to have a couple of very unique partners with ETS and Pearson, who have donated their assessment experts and psychometricians. So being able to just pull the existing game data that's already happening from the SimCity game, and then also looking at the modified SimCity game that we're working on with these experts gives us, I think, a leg up in being able to quickly ascertain if we are or not succeeding in the prototyping phase. But I think equally as important, just echoing what Jesse was saying, is just that real user, teacher, student feedback. So we're a project of the Institute of Play. And for people who don't know the Institute of Play, we've actually created a couple of schools that apply game-based practices to learning in the entire curriculum, and then we also have our game design studios within the schools themselves. So it's not just about bringing people into our office or going out to schools, but actually that co-development process that's most successful.
And so Zoran, what does it look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, in addition to what has been just mentioned, one thing that I've realized is that if you just look at the game to affect learners by themselves, there's actually a limited amount of effect you can get if you ignore the rest of the ecosystem. So what I've been looking at is basically there are actually ways in which games can provide information and enable teacher to become a better teacher. And in fact, a whole bunch of data collection and information that comes from the gameplay can actually inform the teacher about, for example, actually I'll be talking about this in the Ed Talk in the afternoon. You can ask, you can sort of work by collecting the data of what teacher does in the classroom together with a game. You can infer automatically things and say, based on how your kids played this game, here's what you should do for the next 15 minutes, such that you, in the best possible way, help the bottom 15% on your class on this topic. And so that's that kind of integration of the game as an assessment that actually provides direct actionable items for what the teacher should do seems to provide huge amount of effect compared to any possible change I can imagine to do just in a game that affects only the student. And so how do we get that data? The idea is to actually integrate the game and the teacher portal and the teacher should be able to actually give assignments. We call them home plays. Basically, you give assignments that are actually equations that translate themselves into games that kids should play.
So for people who haven't played your games, what does that look like? If you translate an equation into a game, what is a kid going to see?
Yeah, so I mean, the game obviously connects certain mathematical concepts with other aspects of the game. Oftentimes, the best games integrate some other puzzle elements, so for example, spatial reasoning or something else. So basically what you need to do is create games in such a way that you can have any mathematical equation automatically generate a level that requires the student to go through that kind of computation in order to solve the level. And of course, the games are actually not rarely designed like that because the designer actually has full control and creates fixed things. But you can do things like that in this framework, and that's what makes them powerful and infinitely adaptive in many ways.
Can I add one thing on data? So I think there's many different approaches one can take to sort of like creating and using the data that you can create from games. And the approach that we take in our design is when we design these quests, we know about the kinds of challenges that students have in particular conceptual areas. And there's, whether through literature, through a combination of literature and interviews with teachers, we know where students struggle, and we know specifically how they struggle. And we can build things into the game that are specifically meant to elicit those misunderstandings and understandings, and we can sort of collect data that isn't just sort of like trying to make sense of key clicks, but sort of has very particular patterns involved in the design that we know that if they're doing these kinds of patterns, then this is likely what they're thinking. If they're doing these other kinds of patterns, we know that this is likely what they're thinking, because that's the way that the game has been designed.
So if I'm a teacher or a parent or a program officer, the thing I really care about is what the kids can take out of any digital learning experience, whether it's a game or something else. So how do you guys know and look for what students can take from what they've learned in the game and apply it outside and know that they can really transfer it beyond the setting that you guys have really carefully architected for them?
You're looking at me?
Yeah, I'm looking at you.
Well, I think one of the things that games are good at, even commercial, not specifically educational games, is helping transfer within a game. So when you do something in one context in a game, you often have to do a similar, related kind of thing in another context within the same game. And we know that transfer is really hard. It's a humanly hard problem. But games are at least good at helping you sort of do some of that near transfer to other things within the game. So if you have to solve some sort of, building on Zorn's ideas there of mathematical equations, I might have to be sort of manifesting those in one part of the world and understanding those equations in one context and using those same kinds of equations in another kind of context in another part of the world and applying that in a different kind of way. So maybe it's one way about measuring things and one way it's about things about, I'm weighing things, and so I'm doing different kinds of actions in that space. So games are at least good at doing that. I think at this point we can look at transfer to traditional tests. One may look at that as sort of somewhat backwards in a lot of ways, because I think that the knowledge on traditional tests doesn't transfer very well outside of that very isolated context either. So if we ask kids to solve math problems or biology problems or history problems on a test, the way they apply that in the real world is really quite limited and unknown. And in fact, I think in a lot of ways, if they can do that in a game context, it's a better indicator of how well they understand that concept than when they can understand it on paper. I can say at least in our experience that a lot of teachers tell us that their students come back to ideas that they've hit on games throughout the year. And I think that's some of the best ways that we can sort of start to see the impact of the games, is that it's not just the immediate application of that understanding to a problem at hand, but they can come back to that knowledge over time throughout the year.
Yeah, I can echo some of those things. Basically, we create completely different games that subsume the same material. And then the idea is, if you actually can really do well on these kinds of problems in this game, for me, transfer means, can you now solve exactly the same types of problem in a completely different game in a different context? And if the answer is yes, I have very high likelihood that if I give them the actual test, they will be able to transfer it there too, because these contexts between these two games can be actually radically different and include many different things that are nothing similar to the other one. At the same time, one thing that we found is that we really need to embed complete sort of robust testing of conceptual understanding inside of the game. So actually we have our games played both in the classrooms, but also by completely people who all over the place. Basically, there's some games that are basically played by maybe 10,000 people a day, and then we insert the actual tests inside of the game, and they're actually presented in such a way that they look like the sort of the boss level that allows you to transfer to the next level. So we experimented with the actual appearance and how this thing looked like. If you do it the wrong way, you'd lose a lot of players if you do that. But if actually there are ways in which you can do it in such a way that they actually you get huge amount of information. And that has been actually invaluable for our automatic ways to know how to modify the game such that the performance on those tests ends up improving.
So what kind of scale are we talking about? You mentioned tens of thousands of people playing. What are you talking about when you make these conclusions about what works and what doesn't? How many plays and how many players, and why should we have confidence in what you guys are telling us about the value of these games and the learning experiences within them?
I just talked.
Yeah, I mean,
I've never known you to shy away from talking.
Well, there are other people too.
yeah, we operate at a pretty large scale. We have 7 million downloads to date. There are hundreds of thousands of players playing each day and each week. And we're really proud of that. And I think often, my problem with some of these conferences is I often feel like I'm talking about things that don't exist at a large scale. And it's really tough to build any sort of product, whether it's an educational product or any sort of self-improvement product and get it to actually be adopted. And that's what we've built our company off of, is making sure that people are going to be playing each week. And we started with a very simple product, and now we're going into deeper and deeper areas of learning. And we're really proud of that approach. I think it's the way to build any company. It's great we have this grand vision at MindSnacks, but it did start as something very small and pragmatic, and that's been really key to our success.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to what's being said is a unique aspect, I think, to Glass Lab and the investment that's been made behind our work, is that we do have a third party who's been hired to evaluate everything that we do. So that third party, I would just echo the type of approaches that the rest of the team is taking, but having that third party in place before we can release a product, actually saying we have a check mark on that transfer question, is part of the existing product development process that we have in place. And I just think that objectivity and that third party is critical to be able to have the evaluation and the confidence that the market would have in the evaluation that there really is transference from games.
And how many people do you think you're going to reach with this game?
So I think SimCity, this is going to get to one of your other questions, around the technical capacity for school districts to be able to use AAA quality games. So, and that is the elephant in the room right now, is that we really don't have the technical capacity that we need to be able to provide that level of adaptivity, interactivity, that these kids, 97% of teenagers are playing games. They walk into a classroom and they don't have anything close to that level of quality, and they have to leave it at home. And so until we solve that question of how we get that technical capacity up to the level that we need it to be, we're not going to be able to have this level of learning outcomes that we need because of the challenge with the computers.
So I think it's more than a challenge with computers. I mean, if you just look at educational games today, the difference in production value is huge. Any kid or adult taking a look at an educational game knows that it's educational, and that's bad. And so what we've set out to do is we want to eliminate that difference. So we want to feel just as polished as Angry Birds. And for us, our competitor is not another learning tool. It's Bejeweled, and it's Angry Birds, and it's Cut the Rope. And we want to take all that time that's really being spent on useless activities, and we want to pull all that into MindSnacks. And I think it starts with building a really great, refined product and making sure that you have a really professional team that it's not their first go at making a product. That you really need some talented people who have built mainstream products that are highly successful.
So I'm going to strongly disagree with that. It's good. You were
Go for it.
I was going to disagree as well,
Okay,
so I'll let you start.
All right.
I agree, by the way.
Well, actually,
Got one person on my side.
I started thinking that. I mean, I was on that when I started doing this. I thought that was the goal, and then I realized that that actually I think it's actually I have huge amounts of data showing that it's actually very wrong to try to hide the educational purpose of the educational games. I think that there's just no way you can do that, because kids are not stupid. They see through that right away, no matter how fundamentally sophisticated you think your game is. So, but the good thing is that you don't have to do that. The math, science, critical writing, those are all wonderful problem-solving environments that really should be celebrated for what they are. And actually, and if you do that in a creative way, and for example, with Folded, we actually started making it more of a game, and then we realized that huge amount of incentive structures really come from people wanting to be scientists, wanting to basically advance the status quo in the way that the diseases are cures for diseases are handled. So basically that kind of incentive of science, incentive of discovery, incentive of helping somebody else and understand the mathematical equation is the actual set of things that I now completely focused on. And I've had way better results as a result of that.
Yeah,
So what does that lead to? Like, talk about some of your Folded results quickly before we move on, because it's not just thinking of yourself as a scientist, right? There's actually something that comes out of this.
Well, I mean, in Folded, I mean, there 3/4 of people, of our best players, those that are now have more Nature papers than most biochemists in the field, didn't have more than a single chemistry class in their entire education. So whatever the educational process they went through, it completely missed their ability to do these amazing things and help the society as a whole. And so the way that they've gotten to that point is that they found out about the game, and then the game basically created communities of people who started learning more and more about how to explore this vast space of molecular things. And then it's a huge amount of growth happened in the ecosystem around the game, as opposed to the actual, I need to get 10 more points here because then I will rank up. All of those things are very short-lived and do not gain the kind of inspired learners. Basically, you need people to play for 6 months to get them to do experts. There's no way you can do that. Angry Birds cannot do that. So why should we try to do that?
I just want to state something for the record. We're not trying to hide the educational component of Mind Snacks. I don't think great polish, great design, making something easy to use, that's not equated with reducing the educational value of something. That's just smart product design, and that works across any sector. So I'm astonished that would be something that you'd equate with a poorly functioning educational product. For me, it's just the basis of building something that people like to use.
No, I mainly was responding to not having the education be what it is in the games, but trying to not show it as an educational.
Yeah, well, when people use our product, they definitely know that they're there to learn. There's no doubt about that. I mean, you can't get away from that.
Yeah, I think you both are saying two separate things, and I think you're both right. And I think the challenge that we have in this industry is that we've oftentimes tried to beat the benchmark of the textbook from an engagement perspective. If it's slightly better than the textbook, it's engaging. When actually what we should be doing is looking at what kids are doing outside of the classroom and using that as our benchmark for engagement to bring it back into the classroom.
But I want to add something about on the note of polish and about what goes into the game design. I think game design, I think aesthetics are really important. And if you don't pay attention to those, then it will not be a good game. Kids won't enjoy it. But I think that what is engaging, what is good game design, and what is interesting aesthetics is not necessarily the stereotype that we have for our game users. And that means that a lot of times we've done games where we have it's sort of a game where you have these birds and you're nurturing these birds, and people say, high school boys are never going to play that game. That is not something that will be interesting to them. And we had boys on the verge of tears when their birds were dying. And it's about sort of like figuring out the ways that you can connect to the players of the game, the way that you can make it feel meaningful, the way that you can make it feel like aesthetically engaging and consistent. Good usability is really important in there. Sometimes a narrative is really important in there, but it doesn't necessarily need to be expensive 3D graphics. It doesn't necessarily need to be an immersive world. Those are things that can work. I'm not saying those things are not good, but it doesn't have to be. There's a much broader range of gameplay that we see across lots of different genres and lots of different audiences. And in fact, kids, when given the opportunity to play games even outside of their self-identified genres that they like to play, are actually pretty readily engaged in those different genres.
I can actually just add one thing. I mean, I actually have data on this. I mean, basically, we have 50,000 people randomized trial study where we present the same game to people, some with completely deprecated graphics, some with completely missing audio and other things. And we said, we basically observe how long will people actually play on these different things to actually assign the value of how much does it actually matter. And I can tell you that if you change the game mechanics, or the way that the fundamentals of the game, you have drastic effects. If you change the appearance, you have less than 2% difference. If you change the audio, you have no difference. Okay, so these effects, it's important you can improve it significantly, but you can improve it way more, 2 orders of magnitude more by getting the right mechanic and the right way in which it interacts than by the way it actually appears.
So better than a textbook, you guys are optimizing the games, kind of a low bar to start, right? But what do you guys see? Give us some specific examples of where kids are playing your games or others that you know of in which they are staying and learning more and staying more engaged and playing more than they would have if they were just, say, reading a textbook. Like what happens? If I'm a kid and I'm going to drop my textbook after chapter 5 because I'm bored out of my mind, but I've got the opportunity to play one of your games, how long do you see kids staying around and getting involved and moving through? What's the benefit?
I mean, it really depends on the game and the design of the game. And sometimes, so we've done games that are long-form games that are meant to be played across a year. We've done short-form games that are meant to be played sort of similar games across a year. And I can say we designed a series of mobile games in the biology space. We gave kids smartphones that they could use. They could do anything they wanted on them, including playing our games. And then we tracked how much they played our games and what they learned ultimately. Depending on the game, kids would play 1 to 5 hours a week on our game. And these are games that they're casual games, so you play them for a few minutes at a time, come back to them frequently. So even though that they had Facebook on there and they had Angry Birds on there and all these other things, they still came and played these games. And these are I don't know how we didn't measure how much they read their textbooks, but we know it was between 0 and a little bit. Now, that isn't to say all the games sort of made a dramatic difference in their learning. Some of the games did and some of the games didn't, and we learned a lot about what sort of is important in the games that were effective, both in terms of the subject matter that they were addressing and the design of the games in terms of how they level up and how they challenge the students. So it's not just the fact that they had the game that made the difference, but the way that matched the content and the way that that increased the challenge and the level of difficulty in what they were trying to understand.
So let's take a little bit of a different turn here and talk about what it actually takes to make a game. And I'm specifically interested in hearing from you guys what it actually costs, right? Because making these fantastic new products is a lot different than what the education space has seen before and what we've been used to investing in new technologies and tools for kids, particularly when you think about the commercial sector, which is nearly an $80 billion annual market. And the cost for developing a game can be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So what does it take and what does it cost to get something from an idea that you guys have or research you're doing actually into kids and teachers' hands at scale?
I mean, I'm in the startup phase, so I'm not going to answer the question, but I can clarify that it's a very different answer than it was 2 or 3 years ago in the game development space. So there's a very interesting parallel from what's happening in the education industry to what's happening in the games industry. So 5, 10 years ago, it used to be that you just had a couple of huge game companies that were supplying all of the games, similar to how you have a couple of huge publishers who are supplying all the learning materials. Now, when you are looking at the indie game market, you have almost 2 million independent game developers. So if you think of that analogy, the reason for that is because the tools that we can use now to develop games are incredibly easy to acquire and very easy to prototype, get something into the market, and iterate and learn with your user base. So from my vantage point, you need a couple of people and some really good tools to be able to move quickly, and then you can scale just as quickly given the services you have with the cloud hosting environment. So I think it's a very different answer than it was a few years ago.
So what about the evaluation component, though? I mean, this proving learning value, how do you guys think about proving the value of learning? You guys are fortunate enough to have either fantastic research scientists from the best universities in the world on your staff, or external evaluation firms. But once those are gone, or you need to communicate directly the value to customers, how are you guys thinking about that, and how are you going to approach it?
Yeah, so actually that's related to your previous question. So if you wanted to make a game that's education, has some educational content into it, there is a particular cost to it, and you can you don't have to sort of make it doesn't cost too much. However, if you want to have a game that provably makes particular amount of effect on 80% of kids who start playing it, that cost could be potentially 10 times more, mainly because of the amount of time that would take. And so that's mainly the way that and really what I'm really trying to do is get some of those games around. I guess all of us would really like them, but there really is no strategic, effective way to design for something like that, because the game industry has no clue how to do that. That their main goal is how do you get people to pay money either upfront for the game or through some freemium model. If you want long-term learning that transfers onto something else, it's not really clear how to do that in this highly dynamic environment where you can change so many variables all at the same time. So we're still basically at the research stage of how we would actually figure out how to do that. There's a manual process. You collect some data, you look at it, you change something, and you keep doing it. If you do that manually, it's intractable. You won't be able to cover all the variables. So you have to figure out some way to efficiently analyze this space in a way that you can say, okay, I've reached some fixed point of the effectiveness of my game towards measurable things that I really care about. And that's where the cost is.
I want to build on Jessica's answer about cost. So definitely the cost of production has gone down as tools have become better, as means of distribution has become better. I still think, but if we think about the cost of good design, and the cost now as we think about, okay, well, we want to have more than good design, we want to have a good game, but we want to make sure we have good data coming out of that. We want to make sure that we can make sense of that data in good ways. And when you start adding all those pieces in, it's still an expensive process. When you think about all the different parties that need to be involved in that, when you think about it's not just the game, it's not just artists and coders, it's data scientists and learning scientists and evaluation specialists, and when you sort of think about all those things in there to get to the place I think that Zoran is talking about, it's still a fairly large task to take on. It's not just a matter of, well, I'm just going to put this content in the game and put it out there, which in some ways you can do that, and there can be some advantage of it. But to really get to that space, it requires a lot of different kinds of expertise to be pulled together.
So are you guys entering the war for talent? Are you competing with Google and Facebook and other companies that are hiring amazing designers and engineers and data scientists?
Yes.
That sounds expensive.
So I live in San Francisco, and we're housed actually at the EA offices. So my bus stop is the same bus stop that Google and Facebook have, with all of their employees driving down to the valley to work. But I think there's a very interesting transformation happening, that these very young, very talented employees are wanting to make a difference, and they don't know how to let that happen and how to make that happen. So we are able to recruit people who are taking significant pay cuts because they see the opportunity for their work to affect millions of kids versus, can you develop the next app or, yeah.
And I'll say it, for a student at MIT, we have a lot of bright and talented young engineers, and 10 years ago, most of them were going to work for Goldman Sachs because they were quantitative and they paid a lot of money, and they had money at the time. And now we sort of see, and both the financial market has changed, but the social consciousness of those students, I think, is exactly what you're saying there. They want to make a difference in the world. It's not the same students that were even here around 10 years ago. They want to make a difference in the world. They want to participate in these ventures. And there's a lot of excitement in the education space, as we can see here at this conference, and that excites them as well.
So I think you're saying that the answer is grad students.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about where we're going to be 5 years from now. So tell us how you see things changing, where you want to go, and what some of the big obstacles ahead are. What's most acute for you, Jesse? And what do you, yeah, what do you, what
5
are you
years.
worried
I mean,
about
5
next
years is a
project?
long time. I can talk about the next few years and what I find really exciting. I mean, for us, we're firmly invested in touch-based devices. We don't touch the desktop. We probably never will, because we just don't think that's where things are going. So what I think is really exciting about is the social aspect of games. And so right now, if you think about it, even though there are a lot of very popular social games like Words with Friends, there's still a lot of friction involved in actually getting a game together with your friends. And in the classroom, it's an incredibly social environment, so I see a day very soon where everyone has their device and everyone can walk into the classroom and instantly be connected, and they're able to play a social game with no friction whatsoever. And I think some really special games can come out of that. And that's what I'm personally excited about. I don't think that's 5 years away. I think that's 1 or 2 years away. Looking further down the line, obviously really excited about things like Google Glass. I think that some amazing games can come out of that. But that's about it.
I guess for me, what I see is that 5 years from now, we actually have a set of principles and data from how we learn how to automatically synthesize content in this engaging way, such that we can actually cover the greatest amount of the curriculum. And what that means is that is not just thinking of the student, thinking about the parent, student, teacher, and a peer all at the same time. How does the concept of a game that's now played with a single person, or maybe socially with another person on some device, go into the real life, where it basically ends up being something that's exciting for all of these constituents
of a learning ecosystem, such that we can maximize the entire process all at the same time. And so to me, I think that we're just scratching the surface on looking at that complex system and how we can optimize it to promote the best learning. But in 5 years, I think we will start to develop sort of coherent theories about this dual optimization of long-term engagement and mastery of topics. And we will have systematic ways of coverage of larger curriculum that make not just better students, but really empower teachers and parents.
So my dad's a middle school teacher in the South Bronx. What is his classroom going to look like 5 or 10 years from now if he's using your products? How does that change his role? How does it change his interaction with the students?
So I want to agree with everything these guys already said. I think in 5 years, and I'll also feed in yours as well, your second question. In 5 years, I'd like to see games, and I do think we'll see some games moving from the space I think many of them are now, which is a supplemental curriculum, to becoming central curriculum. So rather than the game sort of being the add-on to the text or the video, it's the central artifact, and that doesn't mean there's not places for text and video in that learning process, but that the game is the thing that sort of structures the learning process. And that it doesn't mean necessarily that I'm online all the time structuring my learning. I like the idea that you said, Jesse, of the way that you sort of use it to have social interactions within classes. It can structure challenges that send me out to other places to go do investigations and bring them back. You know, it's become somewhat cliche to sort of think about the teacher as the guide and the facilitator as opposed to the sage. But I really do think that that sort of having games, defining problems that students participate in, can really help teachers play that role. And it's about sort of helping them find the right resources, about helping them work with each other, and learning with them, which I think a lot of teachers would love to do, to learn new things. It's just as exciting for them as it is for everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I think for your dad in particular, the role that he's playing and most middle school teachers are playing right now is the entertainer, that they've got to be up doing this huge song and dance all class long to keep their kids engaged to the level that they're being engaged outside of the classroom. And I think his role will diminish as the entertainer, because the tools that the kids are using are going to be that much more engaging. And the other answer to that question is the reason they're going to be so is because we'll solve this distribution problem. So you guys can see up here there's no big publisher who's sitting at the table talking about games and learning. We're all trying to tackle how do we get these into the hands of the end user at scale, and we don't have an answer right now. We will have an answer in 5 years, and therefore that classroom will look dramatically different than it does today.
Jesse, do you have an answer? You're going direct to consumer already, right?
Yeah, for us, that was the path of least resistance. And you know, when you're a small startup, you know, you basically just want to prove out your concept and get into as many hands as possible. So that's the path that we chose. Now that we have this thing out, there's this pull into the classroom because kids are bringing it to their teachers and say, "Hey, look at me! Like I love this thing. Can we use this in class?" I totally agree with. The way that I see Mind Snacks growing is instead of being this treat that's offered at the end of a class, I really think that we're going to be pulled into the core experience of the classroom, and that's something I'm really excited about.
So how are teachers going to get there? How are schools going to get there, right? That's a massive paradigm shift. Some of it's going to be through working with you guys. Where else do you see it, and what do you need to get there?
I mean, hardware is huge.
Just hardware? So if you guys had, like, if everyone had a one-to-one device, you think you could take off?
You know, for us, we're direct-to-consumer, so I don't have a lot of experience of selling into schools, but if that friction has been reduced, and if a teacher can simply go into the App Store, like an end consumer can go into the App Store and pull up a program that he or she likes, I don't really see a lot of reason why we can't be in every school. So I think it's just about the systems that are created and making sure that there are charging stations and devices available for everyone, and then you know, from there it's in the teacher's hands, and you know, I trust them a lot. So.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this problem a lot, like, because I'm trying to figure out how to really integrate games with teachers, and what you find out is that teachers just don't have time for any extra. They're inundated with key particular pacing elements. They have to cover things way faster than it's humanly possible with kids who are already behind before they even got them. And there's just no way they're gonna, it's very hard for them to take some experimental thing that actually needs to take on a lot of data, and nobody really knows how effective it really is. So I think that is the actual big challenge. And until we have basically champion teachers that say, I basically use this particular incredible, it doesn't have to be game, just like this manipulative that just lit up my classroom, and the effects were just so noticeable that I want to go around all the other schools and tell to other teachers. That's when it's gonna happen. And so I think rather than waiting for administrators to push down some kind of structure, if teachers really start to believe that they're becoming a better teacher and that kids are more inspired as a result of that, that's when it's going to really become effective. And I think that's a hard avenue, but I think the one that I think we need to take.
I'll quickly echo Jessica's publication distribution call, which I think is huge. That is a big barrier right now. But I think one thing we have on our side at this point is the changing standards, and most of the work that we do, not all, but most of the work we do is in math and science, and those new standards, science, which has been just very, very recently ratified at the national level, and math, which has been a little while, those sort of call for really radically different ways of teaching and learning. And I think games align really well with that kind of teaching and learning. And so I think that there's an opportunity here that we're starting to get hardware out there. We're starting to get advocates in the classroom. We still don't quite have publication and distribution set, but there's a lot of good things that could be go into those channels, and I think there's a lot of demand for that at the teacher level.
So you guys are all experts in your fields. What advice would you give to the people at the conference today, investors, other startups looking to find the next big thing or figure out how they're going to make a business out of this space? Jessica, you want to start?
Sure. So I just want to bring us back to that analogy of what's been happening in the games industry and what could be happening in the education industry. That if you think of this idea of now you've got almost 2 million independent game developers who have a very clear distribution channel to their end user, I think that's a very similar area that we'll see in the education industry, and it'll be driven by 3 things. Tablets, which Jesse has mentioned, and just the huge uptick in the devices question being answered. The second is Common Core adoption. That you've got to be able to understand how to teach and learn differently than we have historically, and how to assess differently. And the third area of that is because of the Common Core adoption and the Common Core assessments, there is a big answer coming around the infrastructure that just wasn't there before. I mean, there's huge pressure for these states to get those computers in the schools to be able to do the high stakes assessments that we need. So from an investor perspective, I would just highly recommend that you think of this as the very beginning of a huge movement around how games will finally be successful at achieving learning challenges that we haven't been able to achieve historically.
Yeah, I'm not in any way an investor, I'm a scientist, but if I were an investor, so what kind of things in a game space would I invest to? If I ask myself that question, basically it would be something that carries the proof of effectiveness with it. Or if it doesn't right away, that it has basically a way to continuously improve itself over time by using some very consistent measures. Because I think there's so much you can do with effective marketing. Kids are exciting, look at all these pretty pictures of kids playing the game. But fundamentally, all of those are really short-lived, and those that really, really win are going to be the ones that basically have these really surprising results on actually shifting the actual understanding of hundreds of thousands of kids by a certain percentage. And then the question is, how can you show that? If you have a mechanism to show that one way or the other, that mitigates the risk significantly, and that's the thing that I would invest in. But maybe that's why I'm not an investor.
Sure. I guess I'll give some advice to startups and entrepreneurs who are in the education space. I think one problem I see with education startups that I don't see in other sectors is that they don't have as much pragmatism as other types of entrepreneurs, and I think it's intensely super important for you to focus on being extremely effective and extremely great at one thing. There will always be other learning tools out there that will fill in the gaps. And I see, too often I see entrepreneurs in the education space trying to do so many things, and I know that they'll never get to that next step. And frankly, focusing on monetization is super important. I mean, if you are not monetizing, you will not be around to teach anybody anything in a year. So, and people forget that. And it's, you know, at the end of the day, you are a business, and it's really important to remember that. Otherwise, you'll disappear. So.
I mean, since we expanded the advice a little bit to investors as well as startups, so I think, and this is not perhaps unique to this particular space, but as people are creating startups, it's important to realize that there's a whole sort of history of what we understand about the way that people learn and the way that people teach and what's effective and what's not effective. And it's important to sort of take that into account. Now, it doesn't mean to be stymied by it, because there's still a lot of stuff that we don't know, a lot of paradigms we can shift. But it's important to sort of recognize that and to build on that, that understanding that we do have. And at the same time, we know a lot about what works in games, and to build on that as well. Similarly there's lots of things that there's paradigms to be shifted, and new spaces to be started. But I think it's important to sort of pay attention to what we know in both of those spaces already.
Great. Well, thank you guys very much. It's been terrific. Are there any questions? We have a couple of minutes left. Go ahead.
Hi. In a printed textbook, there's embodied a certain scope and sequence. And a lot of teachers will rearrange that and teach chapters in different order. In a game, it's possible it might even be more restrictive, because you have to finish level 3 before you go to level 4. And I wonder if you could talk about some examples where people have broken up a long strand into a lot of pieces to observe what the students choose and organically figure out a good progression. And if that's been done, what data do we have about how individualized those progressions are between students? Or can we design games to derive those progressions and let students choose their own pathways?
You come at 2 p.m. To the Ed Talk. I'll be talking about it for about 30 minutes. But yeah, I think I think that's actually how you have to do it. I think I'll show some data where the expert progressions actually, when put to test with specialized adaptive progressions, end up being highly inferior in a number of different ways. So that's not because experts are bad. It's just that the space is so large and there's so many key variables that cannot be predicted that it's just very, very hard for somebody to, no matter how much data they have, to actually decide what to change next for the best effect. And so what we're doing is basically letting the game itself automatically adapt. So basically the more kids play, the better it will get, and the higher specialization will occur through that. And I'll talk about that this afternoon.
Great. Another question?
Can you hear me? Yeah. So 3 issues came up towards the end of the excellent panel here. One is kind of discoverability, or 2, discoverability and distribution of learning games, and the third is the monetization question. And regarding the first 2, I just wanted to throw one statistic out there. I mean, I'm from BrainPop, and through GameUp, we are doing distribution of learning games. A few of you are very familiar with that as partners. And just to put a statistic on this, over the last 12 months, we've seen almost 1.5 million hours of play of learning games. And these are the cumulative games, 60 or so games of a couple of dozen of publishers of learning games from the various sectors. So it can be done. It's true that not a lot of people are trying to do it. And that ties into the third point, which is monetization. So we're not doing monetization of it. And that might be the reason why none of the publishers are interested in stepping into this role, nor the search engines, nor anyone else who could have been doing this. But that question of monetization is super important to us because ultimately if the game designer doesn't find a way to monetize, if our partners don't find a way to monetize, as Jesse pointed out, some are not going to be around and some are going to languish and some are not going to be as sharp and as developed as they need to be. So that'll be the next challenge that we try tackling with our partners, just to put some numbers there.
Great, thanks. Next question behind you.
Great stuff, thanks all of you. With the possible exception of Foldit, it sounds like all the games you've been working on are K through 12. What do you see the future of learning games at the university level to be?
MIT has our MITx platform, part of edX, and right now I'm chairing committee at MIT to look at this, what we should be doing with games. And I think in that space, we're thinking about games as both a pedagogy and a technology. So it's important to think about the ways that we can use ideas of the way that people engage in games as part of lots of different experiences. And some of those we already do at MIT. We have challenges, competitions. There's elements of sort of game, important elements of games sort of manifested in a lot of the activities we do already, and we could be doing a lot more of that. And I think in particular it's about, one of the ideas that I found really intriguing is, if we look at a lot of the way that online learning is sort of situated now, there's a very specific model that people follow. There's videos followed by problems. And games can, again, I sort of see games becoming more central there as opposed to supplementary there. And part of what the games can do then is sort of shape a problem space for learners. And then the learners then need to learn particular things, and maybe they watch a video at that point or read a text and bring that into the game. And I also see that being done as something that you might do before class, so that when you come to class, maybe that's the place where you still have sort of lectures or sections or discussions, but you come to that space with gameplay behind you. The barriers are a lot different. I mean, so we don't necessarily have the technological barriers at the university level. Lots of universities have great pipelines into them. There's almost a one-to-one device there as well. There's no central purchasing, but the problem is that it's extremely decentralized at the individual professor level. So sort of creating institutional change is something that needs to happen place by place, and that's a difficult challenge. So I can think about the ways that we're thinking about doing that at MIT, but it is something that happens on a campus by campus basis.
So Eric, are we going to be seeing the first game-based MOOC from you next year?
Sometime, hopefully.
Soren, do you want to jump
Yeah,
in?
so in my mind, I mean, we're doing a number of these other scientific discovery games now that we kind of stumbled upon that genre altogether. So for example, synthetic biology is a discipline that there are basically 60 experts in the whole world. We're developing a game where where the entire molecular design of molecules that do not currently exist in nature can actually be structured as a sort of a Lego set with molecules, and as such, it can be presented to everybody to sort of both be introduced to this exciting discipline, but also be able to push the boundaries. So I think we can increase the number of experts in that field by a factor of 100, simply because there's 60 now. It should in about a year or two. So we're looking at many different sweet spots of scientific discovery, where at the college level, that's a natural way in which people get pulled into disciplines, but really sort of it's a fast-forward track to go directly to the edge of the scientific research and pick up all the knowledge you need to because you want to get there.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. We're out of time. It's been great. Really appreciate it.